25. Clouds began to build in the sky around 2 o'clock. But at first none of us took them seriously. It hadn't rained since the early days of July, so why should it rain now? But they kept building to the south of us, up and up and up, thunderheads in great pillars as purple as bruises, and they began to move slowly our way. I looked at them closely, checking for that membrane beneath. That means it's already raining 20 miles away or 50. But there was no rain yet. The clouds were still just building. Vern got a blister on his heel, and we stopped and rested while he packed the back of his left sneaker with moss stripped from the bark of an old oak tree. "Is it going to rain, Gordy?" Teddy asked. "I think so." "Pisser," he said, and sighed. "That pisser good end to a pisser good day." I laughed, and he tipped me a wink. We started to walk again, a little more slowly now, out of respect for Vern's hurt foot. And in the hour between 2 and 3, the quality of the day's light began to change, and we knew for sure that rain was coming. It was just as hot as ever, and even more humid, but we knew. And the birds did. They seemed to appear from nowhere and swoop across the sky, chattering and crying shrilly to each other. And the light. From a steady, beating brightness, it seemed to evolve into something filtered, almost pearly. Our shadows, which had begun to grow long again, also grew fuzzy and ill-defined. The sun had begun to sail in and out through the thickening decks of clouds, and the southern sky had gone a coppery shade. We watched the thunderheads lumber closer, fascinated by their size and their mute threat. Every now and then it seemed that a giant flashbulb had gone off inside one of them, turning their purplish, bruised color momentarily to a light gray. I saw a jagged fork of lightning lick down from the underside of the closest. It was bright enough to print a blue tattoo on my retinas. It was followed by a long, shaking blast of thunder. We did a little bitching about how we were going to get caught out in the rain, but only because it was the expected thing. Of course, we were all looking forward to it. It would be cold and refreshing, and leech-free. At a little past 3:30, we saw running water through a break in the trees. "That's it!" Chris yelled jubilantly. "That's the Royal!" We began to walk faster, taking our second wind. The storm was getting close now. The air began to stir, and it seemed that the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the space of seconds. I looked down and saw that my shadow had disappeared entirely. We were walking in pairs again, each two watching a side of the railroad embankment. My mouth was dry, throbbing with a sickish tension. The sun sailed behind another cloud bank, and this time it didn't come back out. For a moment the bank's edges were embroidered with gold, like a cloud in an Old Testament Bible illustration, and then the wine-colored, dragging belly of the thunderhead blotted out all traces of the sun. The day became gloomy. The clouds were rapidly eating up the last of the blue. We could smell the river so clearly that we might have been horses, or perhaps it was the smell of rain impending in the air as well. There was an ocean above us, held in by a thin sack that might rupture and let down a flood at any second. I kept trying to look into the underbrush, but my eyes were continually drawn back to that turbulent, racing sky. In its deepening colors you could read whatever doom you liked: water, fire, wind, hail. The cool breeze became more insistent, hissing in the firs. A sudden, impossible bolt of lightning flashed down, seemingly from directly overhead, making me cry out and clap my hands to my eyes. God had taken my picture, a little kid with his shirt tied around his waist, duck bumps on his bare chest and cinders on his cheeks. I heard the rending fall of some big tree not 60 yards away. The crack of thunder which followed made me cringe. I wanted to be at home reading a good book in a safe place, like down in the potato cellar. "Jesus!" Vern screamed in a high, fainting voice. "Oh, my Jesus Christ, look at that!" I looked in the direction Vern was pointing and saw a blue-white fireball bowling its way up the left-hand rail of the GS&WM tracks, crackling and hissing for all the world like a scalded cat. It hurried past us as we turned to watch it go, dumbfounded, aware for the first time that such things could exist. 20 feet beyond us it made a sudden pop and just disappeared, leaving a greasy smell of ozone behind. "What am I doing here, anyway?" Teddy muttered. "What a pisser!" Chris exclaimed happily, his face upturned. "This is gonna be a pisser like you wouldn't believe." But I was with Teddy. Looking up at that sky gave me a dismaying sense of vertigo. It was more like looking into some deeply mysterious marbled gorge. Another lightning bolt crashed down, making us duck. This time the ozone smell was hotter, more urgent. The following clap of thunder came with no perceptible pause at all. My ears were still ringing from it when Vern began to screech triumphantly, "There! There he is! Right there, I see him!" I can see Vern right this minute if I want to. All I have to do is sit back for a minute and close my eyes. He's standing there, on the left-hand rail like an explorer on the prow of his ship, one hand shielding his eyes from the silver stroke of lightning that has just come down, the other extended and pointing. We ran up beside him and looked. I was thinking to myself, Vern's imagination just ran away with him, that's all. The suckers, the heat, now this storm, his eyes are dealing wild cards, that's all. But that wasn't what it was, although there was a split second when I wanted it to be. In that split second I knew I never wanted to see a corpse, not even a run-over woodchuck. In the place where we were standing, early spring rains had washed part of the embankment away, leaving a gravelly, uncertain 4-foot drop-off. The railroad maintenance crews had either not yet gotten around to it in their yellow diesel-operated repair carts, or it had happened so recently it hadn't yet been reported. At the bottom of this washout was a marshy, mucky tangle of undergrowth that smelled bad, and sticking out of a wild clock spring of blackberry brambles was a single, pale, white hand. Did any of us breathe? I didn't. The breeze was now a wind, harsh and jerky, coming at us from no particular direction, jumping and whirling, slapping at our sweaty skins and open pores. I hardly noticed. I think part of my mind was waiting for Teddy to cry out, "Paratroops over the side," and I thought if he did that I might just go crazy. It would have been better to see the whole body, all at once, but instead there was only that limp, outstretched hand, horribly white, the fingers limply splayed, like the hand of a drowned boy. It told us the truth of the whole matter. It explained every graveyard in the world. The image of that hand came back to me every time I heard or read of an atrocity. Somewhere attached to that hand was the rest of Ray Brower. Lightning flickered and stroked. Thunder ripped in behind each stroke as if a drag race had started over our heads. Chris said. The sound not quite a cuss word, not quite the country version of shit as it is pronounced around a slender stem of timothy grass when the baler breaks down. Instead it was a long, tuneless syllable without meaning, a sigh that had just happened to pass through the vocal cords. Vern was licking his lips in a compulsive sort of way as if he had tasted some obscure new delicacy, a Howard Johnson's 29th flavor, Tibetan sausage rolls, interstellar escargot, something so weird that it excited and revolted him at the same time. Teddy only stood and looked. The wind whipped his greasy, clotted hair, first away from his ears and then back over them. His face was a total blank. I could tell you I saw something there, and perhaps I did in hindsight. But not then. There were black ants trundling back and forth across the hand. A great whispering noise began to rise in the woods on either side of the tracks, as if the forest had just noticed we were there and was commenting on it. The rain had started. Dime-sized drops fell on my head and arms. They struck the embankment, turning the fill dark for a moment, and then the color changed back again as the greedy, dry ground sucked the moisture up. Those big drops fell for maybe 5 seconds, and then they stopped. I looked at Chris, and he blinked back at me. Then the storm came, all at once, as if a shower chain had been pulled in the sky. The whispering sound changed to loud contention. It was as if we were being rebuked for our discovery, and it was frightening. Nobody tells you about the pathetic fallacy until you're in college, and even then I noticed that nobody but the total dorks completely believed it was a fallacy. Chris jumped over the side of the washout, his hair already soaked and clinging to his head. I followed. Vern and Teddy came close behind, but Chris and I were the first to reach the body of Ray Brower. He was face down. Chris looked into my eyes, his face set and stern. An adult's face. I nodded slightly, as if he had spoken aloud. I think he was down here, and relatively intact instead of up there between the rails and completely mangled, because he was trying to get out of the way when the train hit him, knocking him head over heels. He had landed with his head pointed toward the tracks, arms over his head like a diver about to execute. He had landed in this boggy cup of land that was becoming a small swamp. His hair was a dark reddish color. The moisture in the air had made it curl slightly at the ends. There was blood in it, but not a great deal, not a gross-out amount. The ants were grosser. He was wearing a solid-colored dark green T-shirt and blue jeans. His feet were bare, and a few feet behind him, caught in tall blackberry brambles, I saw a pair of filthy, low-topped Keds. For a moment I was puzzled. Why was he here and his tennies there? Then I realized, and the realization was like a dirty punch below the belt. My wife, my kids, my friends, they all think that having an imagination like mine must be quite nice. Aside from making all this dough, I can have a little mind movie whenever things get dull. Mostly they're right, but every now and then it turns around and bites the shit out of you with these long teeth. Teeth that have been filed to points like the teeth of a cannibal. You see things you'd just as soon not see. Things that keep you awake until first light. I saw one of those things now. Saw it with absolute clarity and certainty. He had been knocked spang out of his Keds. The train had knocked him out of his Keds just as it had knocked the life out of his body. That finally rammed it all the way home for me. The kid was dead. The kid wasn't sick. The kid wasn't sleeping. The kid wasn't going to get up in the morning any more or get the runs from eating too many apples or catch poison ivy or wear out the eraser on the end of his Ticonderoga No. 2 during a hard math test. The kid was dead. Stone dead. The kid was never going to go out bottling with his friends in the spring, gunny sack over his shoulder to pick up the returnables of retreating snow uncovered. The kid wasn't going to wake up at 2:00 a.m. on the morning of November 1st this year, run to the bathroom and vomit up a big glurt of cheap Halloween candy. The kid wasn't going to pull a single girl's braid in homeroom. The kid wasn't going to give a bloody nose or get one. The kid was can't, don't, won't, never, shouldn't, wouldn't, couldn't. He was the side of the battery where the terminal says neg. The fuse you have to put a penny in, the wastebasket by the teacher's desk, which always smells of wood shavings from the sharpener and dead orange peels from lunch, the haunted house outside of town where the windows are crashed out, the no trespassing signs whipped away across the fields, the attic full of bats, the cellar full of rats. The kid was dead, mister, ma'am, young sir, little miss. I could go on all day and never get it right about the distance between his bare feet on the ground and his dirty Keds hanging in the bushes. It was 30+ inches. It was a Google of light years. The kid was disconnected from his Keds beyond all hope of reconciliation. He was dead. We turned him face up into the pouring rain, the lightning, the steady crack of thunder. There were ants and bugs all over his face and neck. They ran briskly in and out of the round collar of his T-shirt. His eyes were open, but terrifyingly out of sync. One was rolled back so far that we could only see a tiny arc of iris. The other stared straight up into the storm. There was a dried froth of blood above his mouth and on his chin, from a bloody nose, I thought, and the right side of his face was lacerated and darkly bruised. Still, I thought, he didn't really look bad. I had once walked into a door my brother Dennis was shoving open, came off with bruises even worse than this kid's, plus the bloody nose, and still had 2 helpings of everything for supper after it happened. Teddy and Vern stood behind us, and if there had been any sight at all left in that one upward staring eye, I suppose we would have looked to Ray Brower like pallbearers in a horror movie. A beetle came out of his mouth, trekked across his fuzzless cheek, stepped onto a nettle, and was gone. "Did you see that?" Teddy asked in a high, strange, fainting voice. "I bet he's fucking full of bugs. I bet his brains Shut up, Teddy, Chris said, and Teddy did, looking relieved. Lightning forked blue across the sky, making the boy's single eye light up. You could almost believe he was glad to be found, and found by boys his own age. His torso had swelled up, and there was a faint, gassy odor about him, like the smell of old farts. I turned away, sure I was going to be sick, but my stomach was dry, hard, steady. I suddenly rammed 2 fingers down my throat, trying to make myself heave, needing to do it, as if I could sick it up and get rid of it, but my stomach only hitched a little and then was steady again. The roaring downpour and the accompanying thunder had completely covered the sound of cars approaching along the back Harlow Road, which lay bare yards beyond this boggy tangle. It likewise covered the crackled crunch of the underbrush as they blundered through it from the dead end where they had parked. And the first we knew of them was Ace Merrill's voice, raised above the tumult of the storm, saying, "Well, what the fuck do you know about this?"